Deputy Speaker, and I'm really pleased to contribute to the debate this afternoon. And there are three big points that I wanted to make in the time allotted to me. The first is that the labour market issues and other concerns that Labor had about this agreement were very real, but in large part they've been resolved, and I'll take some time to go through some of the issues that we identified and how they did ultimately get resolved. The second point I want to talk about is agreement with some of the comments made by the member for Longman that there is significant opportunity in this agreement, significant opportunity in China. But the third point I want to talk about is the barriers we face to embracing those opportunities. One of our very intelligent caucus members said today that on the other side they see a trade agreement as the end of the discussion. We see a trade agreement as the beginning of a discussion, and I want to talk about some of the policies that Labor wants to implement to ensure that we don't just have a great-looking piece of paper, but we've got lots of people who are benefiting from the agreement right across the Australian economy. So, Deputy Speaker, I think we can all say in full frankness that the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement contains some provisions that Labor would not have signed up to. There are real issues with the way that this agreement was negotiated in terms of the ability that it gave Chinese business owners in Australia to bring Chinese labour into the country and to do what we saw as threaten some Australian jobs. Some of the things that were allowed under the agreement, Deputy Speaker, were for companies that were undertaking projects worth more than $150, which in infrastructure terms is actually not such a large number, would be able to use Chinese labour on those projects. The other issue, Deputy Speaker, one of the other issues was around skills assessment. So the agreement specifically laid out a set of skills for which a visa could be granted without the applicant having to demonstrate ability. These are amongst two of a range of issues that Labor saw in the agreement. We went out and talked to Australians, and they talked to us about worries that they had and how this would affect them. And so that's the basis on which we've really negotiated with the government. And I want to pay tribute to the Minister, Senator Wong, in the other place, who has done something really quite extraordinary and made bigger amendments, a bigger change to this agreement than I think any other trade agreement that Australia is signatory for. Excuse me. So some of the things that have been achieved through the negotiations of Senator Wong and the team, the Labor team, working with our leader Bill Shorten. So labour market testing, that the fundamental issue has been resolved. So labour market testing will now be written into all work agreements for all different types of jobs in Australia. An Australian jobs test, again, will be now written into departmental guidelines. Training plans were important for Labor, and again, that's been written into departmental guidelines. Skills transfer requirements have been implemented. Overseas worker support plans have been implemented. Something quite important, Deputy Speaker, is that because of Labor's changes, because of the ChAFTA Plus, the Minister will now have an ability to include conditions such as ceilings on 457 workers. Something else that's been very important to Labor is around transparency. We want to understand what the labour market impacts of this agreement are over time. So Labor's been able to negotiate for the Immigration Department to report annually on the impact on Australian workers of the agreement. So that gives a little bit of a flavour to how wide and how varied and how significant the changes that Labor's been able to negotiate, Deputy Speaker. And I think this is quite consistent with Labor's philosophy and Labor's approach to trade, and that is that we really are the party of free trade. We've done so much on this side of the House to open up Labor's economy to the world, to help our exporters access overseas markets. But we're not going to do it in a way, Deputy Speaker, that means ordinary Australians don't benefit. That's not what the Australian government's there for. So I'm very proud of the changes that have been made, and it now allows us as a parliament to turn our minds more to the opportunities and the benefits of this agreement and what it is that we need to do as Australians to embrace them. And I say that, Deputy Speaker, with full acknowledgement that there are some significant wins in the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. We hear a lot about the opening up for goods exporters, so a lot about the potential for wine tariff reductions in manufacturing goods, our resources and commodities. Dairy has been a really significant winner under the agreement. And those things are all very exciting, Deputy Speaker. But we shouldn't confuse the extraordinary difference this will make to the services industry and the ability of services to export to China. So, Deputy Speaker, things like financial services, like education, things like mining services. We have some of the best firms in the world in that regard. Things like telecommunications, legal services, constructions, architects, these are the sorts of people who will now be able to realistically export their services to China. Speaker, I haven't seen what I believe to be good estimates of the jobs figures, but I think when we want to understand the potential impact of this agreement, we need go no further than look at the quantum of the market size in China versus Australia. And I'll just share a few figures with the House. If we're looking at education, Deputy Speaker, the number of young people living in China between the ages of 5 and 20, so in Australia it's about 4 million, just over 4 million, and in China it is 236 million. 236 million young people living in that country. If we look at motor insurance, Deputy Speaker, there are 18 million cars on the road in Australia at the moment. In China, there are 154 million cars on the road. So one of the provisions in this agreement allows motor insurers to export their products to China, and that's the market size that they'll be looking at. I say again, in financial services, Deputy Speaker, there are 236 people living in Australia right now who have more than $100 million in private wealth. That number in China is almost 1 million and growing. So you can just see, Deputy Speaker, that there's an enormous opportunity to be captured here, and a free trade agreement gets us at least to that first step. So the benefits that we see are significant. With goods, we're going to see jobs growth, some jobs growth in Australia, some revenue and profits realised in Australia, and with the services, both those delivered here in Australia and offshore in China, we hope to see some jobs results there as well. Deputy Speaker, we talked down a little bit in services. We talked down a little bit the services economy in Australia, but I think when you actually look at the data, there's a lot of reason to really celebrate what we see as a thriving services industry in our country. The reality is the vast majority of Australia's GDP is generated through services. The vast majority of Australians work in services, and that's something that we should be celebrating. And the reason for that is that when we look at economies around the world, it's quite clear that as economies develop, services take up, over time, a larger share of their economy. That's just what we've seen happen to Australia. Deputy Speaker, the agreement is important, of course, for another broader reason, which I haven't really touched on, which is just that it will allow Australia to export more. And again, when we look at the data, we can see that there's significant opportunity for us to grow faster if we're able to export more. There's a simple fact in all this, and that is that if we look to 2020, Australia's economy is projected to grow at just under 3%, but we have quite a large growing population, so it's actually not such a large figure. But the Chinese economy is projected to grow more than 6%, Deputy Speaker. So if we can tap into that growth, then we're going to grow faster. It's simple maths. We also see it, Deputy Speaker, when we look at the share of our GDP of which exports makes up. For a country like Australia, it's actually quite a small share of our GDP which comes from exports, and that's something that this agreement will have some capacity at least to change. So when we look at the ratio of exports to imports, in 2012, Australia was exporting about 21%. But a nation like Korea, Deputy Speaker, was exporting 57%. So we can see that there's significant growth potential there. So, Deputy Speaker, one other point that I want to mention before I move on to some of the barriers that continue to lie in the path of accessing the benefits of the agreement is just to note that we talk a lot on the Labor side about the jobs of the future. And when we look at the 10 fastest high-skill growing jobs today, they're all jobs in services. And in fact, when we look at the 10 fastest low-skill jobs that are growing today, I think 9 out of 10 of those are in services. So this is just the reality, Deputy Speaker, and the quicker that we understand how to promote and build a strong, thriving, high-skill services economy, then the quicker that we are going to take up these opportunities. So, Deputy Speaker, one critical difference that we will find between the ongoing approach to this agreement on the other side of the House and this side of the House is that we regard, as I said before, this is the beginning of the discussion about China engagement, not the end of it. Because what we see is that there's a real discussion in the Australian community, the tone of which suggests that there's a feel that this is a fait accompli, that Asian engagement, that our connection to China, that our growth being built on this China opportunity is just going to happen without us really trying. And when we look at the figures, Deputy Speaker, There's lots of evidence to suggest that that's absolutely, completely incorrect. And there's a lot more thinking that we need to do as a country, both within government, within the private sector, as to how we're engaging with Asia and look at ways that we can improve it, because today, Deputy Speaker, we are quite behind where we need to be. Deputy Speaker, one really great microcosm of the deficiencies in this area is the treatment of the Australia in the Asian Century White Paper. Deputy Speaker, we had a government on this side of the House that worked incredibly hard, negotiated and consulted widely and put together a really excellent document that would chart Australia's increased engagement with Asia over what will be the Asian century. And Deputy Speaker, what we've seen is that paper brimming full of policy ideas has been taken down from all the government websites. It's been, thrown in the bin, locked in all the cupboards, and it's as if the document didn't exist. And I hope, Deputy Speaker, with the new Prime Minister, that we have an opportunity for that new Prime Minister to say that this was good policy, it was a good document, and it was a set of initiatives that are urgently needed to resolve this problem of Asian engagement. Deputy Speaker, it's particularly critical because what we see is that the services exports that we talk about so excitedly in the chamber are going to require a much deeper level of engagement than what we would usually regard as essential for goods exporting. So if I can just provide a quick example, what we might see, for example, for an export of wine is that an exporter really needs one really good quality relationship to be able to make an export opportunity work in China, because they can transfer ownership of wine on the dock to an importer in China, and the legwork can be done at the other end. It's not how all the export arrangements work, but it's how some of them work. But what we're talking about here, Deputy Speaker, is an opportunity in aged care, for example, where an Australian business person is going to be expected to find partners in Asia, buy property, to understand complex regulatory environment for assisting the aged, cultural things about how to care for people when they're sick, extensive human resources and staff management issues. And these are very delicate matters that are going to be hard to do if we're going to require interpreters at every step of the way. So, Deputy Speaker, things like Asian language, spending time overseas, studying in Asia, all of these things will be really critical. So, Deputy Speaker, I'll conclude my comments because I know that we are trying to move through this debate quite quickly, but I'll just reiterate that I'm really proud of the way that Labor has handled this agreement. We've been able to step back from what has been a pretty fiery public debate and accept that there are benefits on the table here, but also acknowledge that we need to conduct our free trade negotiations in a way that ensures free trade benefits ordinary Australians. And that's what we've been able to do, and I'm very proud to support this on behalf of the people of Hotham. Thank you.
I thank the member. The question is that the spill be now read as